A battered, wrecked old man, thrown on this savage shore, far, far from home, pent by the sea and the dark, rebellious brows, 12 dreary months, sore, stiff with many toils, sickened and nigh to death. I take my way along the island's edge, venting a heavy heart. Steersman, unseen, henceforth the helms are thine. Take thou command. What, to my petty skill, thy navigation? My hands, my limbs grow never less. My brain feels racked, bewildered. Let the old timbers part, I will not part. I will cling fast to thee, O God. Though the waves buffet me, thee at last I know. Is it the prophet's thought I speak, or am I raving? What do I know of life? What of myself? I know not even my own work, past or present. Dim, ever-shifting guesses of it spread before me, of newer, better worlds, their mighty patrician, mocking, perplexing me. And these things I see suddenly. What mean they? As if some miracle, some hand divine, unsealed my eyes. Shadowy, vast shapes smile through the air and sky. And on distant waves sail countless ships, and anthems in new tongues I hear, saluting me. Prayer of Columbus. Walt Whitman, 1871. Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 157. Son of Genoa. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, a rhyme memorized by perhaps millions of school children throughout eons of years. But did you know that Columbus conducted 4, not 1, voyages to the New World? Columbus's expeditions, which were the outgrowth of the foundational work by men like Henry the Navigator and others, changed the world forever, and, many have argued, for the worse. It is without a doubt that Columbus's discovery of the New World, by which, of course, I mean European discovery, changed the Americas for the worse, for those people already living there, at least in immediate terms. I have seen estimates as high as 95% that answer the question. What happened to all the Indians? An incorrect term, of course. After Columbus landed in the New World. Disease, war, slavery, you name it. The insatiable European lust for gold and eventually other resources brought out the worst in mankind. This is all not to even mention the West African slave trade, which exploded in the wake of Columbus's discovery as, without all those Native Americans, Europeans were going to need someone to grow sugar cane in the New World. Many communities in the United States no longer celebrate Columbus Day, preferring Indigenous Peoples Day instead. Columbus himself, as we will see, was no stranger to slavery, and his treatment of the Native Americans in the Caribbean leaves much, all caps, to be desired. Yet, is it fair to lay the blame for the deaths of millions of people squarely on the shoulders of one man? That, to me, seems unlikely. When in college, I first read Howard Zinn's excellent People's History of the United States. I love the book today, and it remains highly influential. But in that book, Columbus is always portrayed as the archetype villain, as a sort of bloodthirsty monster. But as I always caution people, don't look for inherent foreshadowing in history. There was no guarantee that Columbus was going to make it to the New World in 1492. Even if he did, there are many different ways that affairs might have worked out. Our world, after all, is but one of many possibilities. Finally, as you listen to these episodes, I really want you to think about Columbus's intent. It's a theme I'm going to come back to over and over again. Did he intend the Europeans' treatment of the New World to work out how it did? Now, I certainly have no intention of giving Columbus in these episodes a pass for his behavior, which is more often than not morally reprehensible. But nor do I expect him or anyone to atone for the sins of an entire continent. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy in 1451, 2 years before the fall of Constantinople. Las Casas, Columbus's most important biographer and humanitarian, relates that during Roman times, the name had been Colonus, but that Christopher had elected Colon instead. So when he appears in the Genoese record books for the first time as an adult in 1470, it reads, Cristobal Colon. Quote, in the name of our Lord, Christopher Columbus, son of Domenichino, more than 19 years of age, and in the presence of and by the authority, advice, and consent of Domenico, his father, present and authorizing, voluntarily confessed, in truth publicly recognized, that he must give and pay to Pietro Bellisio of Porto Maurizio, son of Francesco, present 48 lire, 13 soldi, and 6 denari d'Ingenovi, and this is for the remainder owed for the wine sold, and consigned to the same Christopher and Domenico by Pietro. End quote. Columbus's mother was Susanna Fontenasora, daughter to a prosperous landowning family outside Genoa. We know little about her. She died in 1480. Genoa was the ideal place for a future maritime explorer to be born. Maritime trade was the key to the city's existence. The 3 most important government offices all related to the sea. The Office of the Sea had final say over the harbor and the shore. The Office of the Commune Fathers oversaw the docks and the piers. And the Office of Health worked tirelessly to ensure that anyone even suspected of plague was quarantined before coming into the city. In the 14th century, before the plague, Genoa had been one of the most important cities in Europe. But its constant wars with the Catalans and the French, plus the reality that it was a tiny city-state seeking to compete with 2 major European powers, ultimately caused the Republic to lose power. The French through force and diplomacy, gradually overtook the Genoese Republic. In the years leading up to Columbus's birth, even the island of Corsica had grown more powerful than Genoa. Now, that being said, I don't want to overstate or belabor the point. Genoa itself remained one of the largest cities in Western Europe. Its population, 75,000, was equal to London, Paris, and Venice. Now, slavery was well known in Genoa. Almost every household, even the modest ones, had one or two slaves, mostly young females, generally aged 13 to 14, when they were first sold. Because the church prohibited slavery for Christians, these girls were always, quote-unquote, pagan, more or less, and tended to be Russian, Arab, or Balkan. Now, I'm sure as you would expect, these girls suffered terrible sexual violence. In fact, there was a whole legal industry devoted to determining the inheritance rights of children born out of wedlock in Genoa. Some girls, in fact, when they were first sold, were sold on a trial basis to see if they would acclimate to a life of sexual slavery in Genoa. Slaves were, of course, horribly punished for failing to follow commands. A female slave who poisoned her master was tortured until she confessed, and then she was burnt at the stake. This was the slavery to which Columbus was accustomed. Columbus grew up with the sea. An apprentice seaman, he participated in expeditions down the Ligurian, or today Italian, Riviera. He probably sailed with a master and his crew as far as Nice in France, and perhaps even to Corsica, which, despite its growing wealth, was actually still a colony of Genoa at the time. Columbus then spent 8 years in Lisbon in the late 1470s, trying to convince anyone, that further expeditions to the west might be possible. However, in 1482, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope around what is today South Africa. And no one was then interested in listening to Columbus's fanciful stories, when especially there were real lands to be discovered. While in Lisbon, Columbus married Felipe Perestrellos, a fellow citizen of Genoa whose family was trying to make it in the Genoese quarter of what had become truly the center of worldwide exploration. Interestingly, her father had once had the hereditary right to rule the tiny island in the Madeiras, Porto Santo, given to him by no less than Henry the Navigator. While attributions to the father-in-law of seafaring skills seem highly overblown to me in the records, even Las Casas thought that they were embellished. It's interesting to note the close connections between Henry the Navigator and ultimately Columbus. Whatever his actual position on the island, Columbus's father-in-law certainly would have had access to Portuguese maps, charts, and other information about what lay to the west. It is hard to believe, knowing what we now know, that Columbus did not try to make something of these connections. Columbus stayed with the family on Porto Santo for a time where, quote, there were a great many vessels bringing settlers and much talk of fresh discoveries that were being made every day, end quote. Columbus heard one intriguing tale that asserted a recent piece of driftwood, delicately carved, had recently been spotted as far as 500 miles to the west. Could that be proof that there were other lands to the west? Columbus would certainly come to believe there were. Quote, all such tales, wrote Las Casas, certainly fanned the flames of Christopher Columbus's interest in the whole business, end quote. Finally, according to legend, Columbus played host to the pilot of the lost vessel, which had been blown hundreds of miles to the west to a mysterious island before fighting its way back to the Madeiras. According to the tale, Columbus sat up with the man, who ultimately perished, getting all the information he could about the island. But sadly, without longitude, it was impossible to place it. One of the most persuasive sources for Columbus was the so-called Meister Paolo. Now, to be clear, while Columbus was fascinated by Marco Polo and his accounts, though they were now several hundred years old, this Master Paolo was not Marco Polo. Master Paolo was a Florentine physician who, for whatever reason, claimed to know a lot about Asia. Regardless of his, objective lack of knowledge, he created a very influential chart that illustrated how one might get to China by selling west, not east. He, like Marco Polo, referenced the riches of the East and the great Khan who ruled over all of Asia. Unfortunately, as we know from the podcast, that particular piece of information had been incorrect for about 200 years. Columbus took the idea and ran with it, writing back to Meister Paolo that he would get to China by sailing exactly along a path charted by Paolo. Paolo was gratified, writing, quote, "I am gratified to find my map so well understood and to learn that such a voyage is not only theoretically possible, but will now become a fact and a source of honor and estimable gain, and the greatest fame among all Christian men." End quote. Columbus also read and accepted as 100% true Ptolemy's 2nd century work, Geography. This work, which was 1,200 years old already when it reached Western Europe around 1400 CE, was translated into Latin in 1409, making it much more accessible. Sadly, the work, while influential and now accessible, left much to be desired. Ptolemy underestimated the size of the world by 1/6. He did not know about the Americas or the Pacific Ocean. He had no idea how to reckon longitude, a problem that would not be solved until the 18th century. But for Columbus, this work was as good as it got. Living in Portugal with a well-connected wife, her father was, after all, the governor of Porto Santo, Columbus naturally wanted to reach out to the Portuguese king to see if he could get him to greenlight an expedition. Unfortunately for Columbus, the Portuguese at this point in history regarded the Genoese as upstarts in the world of global exploration. Columbus pressed on. Columbus's proposal was straightforward in material terms. He wanted 3 caravels equipped to trade. Columbus believed, of course, he was heading to India or China, and fully crewed. With these 3 ships, Columbus would sail west, link up with the court of the great Khan, and return laden with silks and spices. All this might have been fine, actually, but Columbus's personal requests were a bit more dramatic. He wanted a new title, ideally the Admiral of the Ocean, which seems to just have been the grandest title he could think of. He also wanted to become a Knight of the Golden Spurs, a further title that would allow his descendants to use the surname Don, akin to the noble titles of Duke or Earl in England. More crucially, he wanted money. He wanted revenues from the expedition in perpetuity. Now here I want to quote directly from historian Lawrence Bergeron in his work Columbus, The 4 Voyages, as he so aptly sums up the Portuguese response. Quote, "Even to the Portuguese ears, accustomed to overstatement, this description verged on the absurd. A tireless conversationalist and self-promoter, Columbus never knew when to stop, and he demanded appointment as viceroy and governor in perpetuity of all islands in terra firma discovered either personally by him or as a result of his voyage. And he planned to award himself 1/10 of all the monies accruing to the crown in respect of gold, silver, pearls, gems, metals, spices, and all other articles of value in merchandise of whatever kind, nature, or variety that should be purchased, bartered, discovered, or won in battle throughout the length and breadth of the lands of his jurisdiction. It was clear that Columbus considered himself a partner of the crown's exploration program and potential ruler of a kingdom, moreover, a kingdom larger and wealthier than Portugal itself. End quote. All the king's advisors told him to reject this upstart out of hand. Yet the Portuguese king hesitated, which forced Columbus to wait for an answer. In hindsight, this was an obvious ploy, and the Portuguese during this period worked themselves to see if Columbus's proposed passage might be possible. Trade routes were the intellectual property of the age of exploration, and the Portuguese thought they might be able to steal the idea. In fact, King João II allowed 3 experts to grill Columbus, who, thinking this was all part of some job interview, eagerly told them all he knew. João then commissioned a clandestine expedition based on this information. As Columbus waited, this vessel sailed west, then limped back shattered, its rigging a mess and sails torn. The crew brusquely informed the king that sailing west to China was not possible. When Columbus discovered the deception, he was crestfallen. More so because at about the same time, Philippia, Columbus's wife, died. He had devoted 8 years to trying his enterprise in Portugal, and now he had nothing to show for it save humiliation. But he was not out of options. No, not yet. Columbus could still ask the new Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Dismayed by the Portuguese, Columbus determined to hedge his bets. He would go to Ferdinand and Isabella while his brother, Bartholomew, would go to Henry VII of England, each trying to win the chance to sail west. For his part, Bartholomew was considered to be Columbus's equal in terms of seamanship, plus he was a better politician. Bartholomew was, quote, very shrewd, well versed in the ways of the world, and full of guile, end quote. Bartholomew Columbus flattered and cajoled his way into the English court, where he began to work on the English king. Meanwhile, Christopher Columbus obtained a copy of a letter from a Florentine mapmaker and mathematician, Toscanini, who wrote of a, quote, shorter way of going by sea to the lands of spices than by Guinea, which, of course, was the Portuguese route. Even more than Ptolemy, Toscanini led Columbus to believe he was right. You could get to Asia by sailing west. Armed with said letter, Columbus went to Spain to see the newly married king and queen of a United Kingdom that had once been the rival seats of Castile and Aragon in late 1487. Initially, he failed and wrote to João of Portugal and asked for permission to return. Against all odds, the Portuguese king responded positively, saying, quote, we have great need of your ability and fine talent, end quote. Moreover, he assured Columbus, quote, you will not be arrested, detained, accused, summoned, or prosecuted for any reason whatsoever under the civil and criminal code. Therefore, we beg you and urge you to come soon, and not to be reluctant to do so for whatever reason. End quote. Unfortunately, it seems that King João never planned to use Columbus unless he had to. His prized explorer, Bartolomeo Diaz, returned from exploring the African coast just as Columbus arrived in Lisbon. João likely only intended to use Columbus if Diaz failed to return. Humbled and humiliated again, Columbus returned to Spain. He hoped to never see Portugal again. Ferdinand and Isabella were the first Christian rulers of United Spain since the Visigoths fell from power in the early 8th century. They met actually only 4 days before they were married on October 19th, 1469. They had a very unique relationship because their marriage was political from the outset. Both the Castilians and the Aragonese were interested to make sure that Ferdinand and Isabella had roughly equal powers in the relationship, putting Isabella in a very special position. Privately, the two led separate lives. In person, however, they ruled jointly and made every effort to appear the loving couple. In 1476, Castile smashed the invading army of King Alfonso of Portugal, and from then on, Ferdinand and Isabella became known as the Los Reyes Cataloticos, the Catholic sovereigns. Then, in 1479, when Ferdinand's father died, the two realms officially combined. Ferdinand and Isabella were quick to show interest in Columbus and his ideas. Ferdinand even obtained a copy of Ptolemy's geography for himself, just to better understand what Columbus was talking about. Initially, however, the Spanish monarchs were wrapping up the last piece of the Reconquista. The Muslim kingdom of Grenada, in the far south of the Iberian Peninsula, remained free. But in November 1491, exhausted and without hope, the Muslim emir of Grenada agreed to a secret treaty in which he would surrender the city. On January 2nd, 1492, the Spanish occupied the Alhambra, the Red Fortress that had served as the residency for Muslim emirs for centuries. Columbus claimed to have been there to witness the event, writing, quote, "I saw the royal standards of your highness placed by force of arms on the towers of the Alhambra, and I saw the Moorish king come out of the gates of the city and kiss the royal hands of your highness and the prince, my lord." End quote. While it is likely he only heard about the surrender and did not see it personally, Columbus was astute enough to quickly ally himself with the imperialist tendencies of Ferdinand and Isabella. With the Muslims finally expelled from Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella promptly began taking steps towards what they hoped would be the ultimate reconquest of Jerusalem. While Isabella had been protective of the Jewish peoples early on, in March of 1492, she gave in to the waves of rampant anti-Semitism sweeping the kingdom and Europe in general, and agreed to expel the Jews. Spain now following France and England in doing the same. In all likelihood, this was nothing more than a cold, hard money grab. Jews could convert or leave and forfeit their goods. Spain quickly became wealthy off of the stolen gold. So what to do with the money? Well, hadn't that Columbus guy recently come up with a good idea for expansion? Maybe we give him a call. So in 1492, Isabella invited Columbus back to court. Though his views were far-fetched to say the least, It seems that Columbus's proposals of limitless wealth and grand overseas Christian empires were too much a needed respite for Isabella, likely still reeling over her decision to expel the Jews and the ongoing blood of the Inquisition. Columbus, therefore, received a warm welcome. The proposed expedition consisted of only 3 ships of modest price that the monarchs of Spain could easily afford. Famously, Isabella offered her own crown jewels as collateral to the tax levies that would pay for the voyage. Touching, sure, but no one ever intended to collect on her offer. Instead, in April 1492, they sent Columbus on his way with the following missive. We send Cristobal Colon with 3 caravels through the ocean sea to the Indies on some business that concerns the service of God and the expansion of the Catholic faith and our benefit and unity. End quote. Next time, Columbus sets sail and discovers he's a lot farther from the Indies than he thought. If you're interested in finding more content and supporting the podcast, there's 2 ways to do so. Check out the website at westernsibpodcast.com for a plethora of additional episodes, all kinds of different content. And also, if you want to support the podcast on an ongoing basis and receive constant free deep dive episodes, author interviews, book reviews, and also every single episode free 1 week early, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Western Sib Podcast. It remains the best way to support the show and get, at this point, over, I don't even know, 20, 30 hours of bonus content. Until next time, in Columbus's first voyage.